jumps out the window because he believes that this thing is coming after him in his mind. He basically goes insane, which is much like a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's work. He doesn't like to explain how you get back to society after you're out in the wild in this crazy place or whatever. He really just gets you to the climax part of the story, and then the character basically goes insane usually, or one of the characters anyway, usually goes insane and doesn't remember how they got back and ended up in the hospital or something like that. That's kind of like somewhat of his style or theme of his horror. But this story is really creepy, but I for some reason liked it when I was into these stories. I just remember this story specifically was like one that stood out to me. It's not the most popular one, but I picked it because it's the first in the Cthulhu mythos. And we'll get into who Cthulhu is and what Cthulhu is or whatever later on. But basically this is like the first one that started kind of like, or building the universe where these creatures and places and all these people or whatever can kind of live in. The characters that he's creating. Which is really cool, and that's really what I really liked about this. It really did make me want to write a story, I'm telling you. I mean, like I said before, I wrote a story, a pirate story, similar to this. It's not exactly like this, but it's kind of like this. And it really did make me want to write something. You know, it's pretty fascinating to think about what's under the sea and what kind of giant fish could be living under there. So anyway, now that was the story basically. So now I'm going to analyze it and get into the realities of Dagon and all the stuff around this story. As a Christian, I believe Dagon is a fallen angel. I mean, honestly, that's what I believe Dagon is. There was actually a Dagon, and there was a Dagon that was worshipped in history. It's even in the Bible. Dagon rules in a water domain as a water spirit. He basically rules under the water in a city beneath the water or whatever that probably goes into some kind of a hollow earth thing or whatever. And, well, technically he might even be locked up in Tartarus or whatever you want to call it right now, the prison beneath the earth, you know. And that the Bible does talk about the abyss and all these different types of things, about something being under the ground, and that's where the Titans or fallen angels were locked up. And there are such things as water spirits or whatever, and creatures beneath the sea that it seems like angels aren't just on land, okay? They're not up just walking around us, and fallen angels and angels in general. I believe that they can go under the sea and do all kinds of stuff that we can't do, and you know, the pressure of the ocean doesn't change anything for them, I don't think. So I believe Dagon could really be a real creature that lived under the sea. We don't know what kind of fish are down there. We know that there's big things. I mean, there's chunks. I mean, I remember there was a big chunk of something bitten. Like, it was the size of a sperm whale. But it was a big chunk of something that was bitten off of something. That just basically showed up on the shore of some beach somewhere. I don't remember if it was like California or something. I don't remember where it was, but I think you could find it on YouTube. There's people standing around it. It's this giant chunk that was bitten out of something. Or you got to think, well, what could have bitten that? You know, there's always a bigger fish, as they say. Well, the fish would have to be humongous, like Godzilla, you know, giant. That's interesting to think about. I mean, because we really don't know anything about what's under the ocean. So that's what's really interesting about this story in general. It's just the sheer, you know, imagination. I mean, your mind wanders. Dagon is the father of Baal, or Baal, whatever you want to say, according to ancient mythology. Dagon was the chief deity of the Philistines. Worship of this pagan god dates back to the 3rd millennium BC. 1 Samuel 5 talks about the Ark of the Covenant being put in the temple of Dagon, and God's Ark, which is the Ark of the Covenant, breaks the statue idol of Dagon. So God doesn't exactly like Dagon or idols in general. The Bible is clear about this, and Dagon is a false god. It's not the real God. And if you want to see Dagon worship in today's society, simply just look to the Vatican bishop's hat. The hat that sticks up and it looks like a fish mouth aiming at the sky. Those hats are actually Dagon priest hats. The very same hat that Dagon priests that worship Dagon, the pagan god Dagon, wore back in the day when they worshipped Dagon. So that's an interesting thing if you actually look at the Catholic bishop in Vatican, or I think even the Pope wears the hat. I'm not sure. I just know that you could actually see pictures online, and I think I posted some on this show's group page, so if you look that up you could find it. So that's an interesting take on Dagon in today's society, because all these secret societies that are out there, they tend to worship old gods, like old ancient things like Zeus and stuff like that. It seems like those type of gods come up a whole lot. Nimrod, Baal, stuff like that. Let's not forget that these gods required human sacrifice as well. I mean, that's where it always goes. These pagan rituals and cult activities always require blood sacrifices of humans. Usually, babies and stuff like Planned Parenthood would do. And let's not forget that the biggest thing about Dagon here is the story of Jonah and the whale. Well, it doesn't technically say a whale, it says the giant fish. Jonah was a guy who I believe had a speech impediment, and he couldn't speak very well, and on top of that, he ran from God. He heard God say that he had to go minister to the Ninevites, and he didn't want to do that because he had issue with them because I think they were against the Israelites at one point or whatever, if I remember the story correctly anyway. And so he didn't want to minister to them, and he really hated them. He was angry at them. So he had bitterness in his heart or whatever. But God still was working with him. God was working with him even through all this. But he ran away from God, and he basically got on a ship, and then the whole thing, the people on the ship were Dagon worshippers. I'm not sure if all of them were, but I know the Ninevites worshipped Dagon. But anyway, they cast him overboard, and he ended up in the belly of the fish, but they ended up crying out to his God because they knew that his God was the creator God of all things, And he ended up in the belly of the giant fish, which could have been a prehistoric beast of some sort. I don't know what's under the sea, but it sounds like it was pretty big. And he was tossed and turned, and he said he was in hell at one point. He ended up being in there, and he ended up praying to God and getting, back to God and basically making another covenant with him, in a sense, to do his will and go preach to the Ninevites like he was supposed to do to begin with. He actually calls out to God or whatever, and then God has the giant fish spit him up or whatever on the beach, basically. And then he still has like a 3-day travel to get to Nineveh. And then he finally gets there, and he finally, tells them and warns them in 40 days that the Nineveh will be destroyed or whatever. Against his own will. He really didn't want to do that, but he warned them, and they actually listened. They actually turned around. I kind of wish America would do this. That's my personal point of view on this. So anyway, and then he ended up changing everything. But then he was worried that they were going to see him as a false prophet because he said that it was going to be destroyed in 40 days or whatever, and it wasn't. And so he was bitter and all this, and he was fighting with God. But it's really interesting that Jonah was really against doing what God wanted him to do. The whole way he was kicking and screaming. And even in the end, he was angry. And he still did what God wanted. And also, keep in mind that the Ninevites worshipped Dagon, so they were worshipping a fish god too, and I think they were a coastal city, so they were probably attuned to Dagon more because of the coast and the water and all that stuff. And I'm sure that they might have seen some kind of weird creatures in the sea at some points, or they might have worshipped Dagon because perhaps he actually did live under the water and came out of the water at one point. Because I believe he was a fallen angel, so I believe that he might have been actually requiring worship at some point in history, somewhere back in the day. He was their god, and they turned from Dagon and worshipped the one true God of the Bible. And so it was a happy ending, except for Jonah being crabby and all. So that really sums up Dagon and the story of Dagon and all my analysis on Dagon. But we'll get into other fish-like creatures from the bottom of the sea in the next story that I'm going to do. The Call of Cthulhu, written 1926 by H.P. Lovecraft. Quote, "Someday, the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." That quote from the Call of Cthulhu story really sounds suspiciously like Revelation and the Great Tribulation, when, if time was not cut short for the elect, believers in Jesus Christ, no flesh would be left alive. That quote is talking about Cthulhu, this giant fish creature that's the size of like Godzilla, with like a tentacle octopus like thing on his face with bat wings, and he has a giant arms and legs. It's just this creepy giant creature at the bottom of the ocean. He comes out through like a giant doorway. But the giant creature, Cthulhu is his name, is considered like a god in the H.P. Lovecraft Call of Cthulhu story. And in this mythos, the Cthulhuites, or whatever you want to call them, were aliens that came down from the stars to the earth eons ago, apparently. And also, the Old Ones was another race of beings, kind of like the movie The Thing. That movie kind of reflects the story of At the Mountains of Madness, another H.P. Lovecraft story. But the Old Ones were like kind of like just really bizarre looking creatures. They were really intelligent and they made things. And the Old Ones warred against the Cthulhuites in a great battle before humans and dinosaurs even existed. Cthulhuites went down and lived beneath the sea. And the Old Ones ended up like going into the hollow earth, basically. So that they were below the sea, technically. And they went into the Antarctica and the North Pole kind of areas and ended up kind of disappearing over time when they created different things. They created, supposedly, the human race as slaves, just because they were bored, kind of. And they also made the dinosaurs, and they were all slavery type things, used for whatever they wished for. And then after that, they invented the Shoggoths in these stories. According to H.P. Lovecraft mythos, the Shoggoths were creatures that could change shape and had eyes all over them. And they could mimic the sound of creatures, like copying what you say and copying. The movie The Thing, the one from the 70s anyway, it's a really gory and creepy movie from the 70s with Kurt Russell as the star. That director was heavily into H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness story. So when he made that movie, he made that with that in mind. And the creature that kept taking shape and taking the shape of the dogs and the people in that movie was really in H.P. Lovecraft